A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning into another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to be with you once again. I do apologize that we were not with you for a couple of days last week. We had some construction work going on outside of the compound/studio space, and I literally could not get to the place where we record this program each and every day, and so there was absolutely nothing that I could do. But I am glad to be back with you once again. We've got a busy show for you, a lot of stuff to talk about today. Before we jump into things, I do want to wish my lovely bride, Miss E, a very, very happy birthday today. And if you would like to send along your well wishes, you can just leave them in the comments here at the YouTube video, where you can tweet at me at Cam Edwards. I will make sure that she gets each and every one of those. She's not on Twitter. She knows better. So there is that. All right. We've got a little bit of breaking news to get to, actually, on this Monday. The governor of Wisconsin, Tony Evers, says he is calling a special session on gun control. Specifically, the governor wants to pass two pieces of legislation. One, a quote-unquote red flag law. The other, quote-unquote universal background checks. And he says that this is going to make Wisconsin a safer place. Yeah, he said he's convening a special legislative session, which, according to the Journal-Sentinel, allows the governor to force lawmakers to consider legislation on a topic of the governor's choice. He said today, quote, "Since taking office in January, I have called on the legislature to take action and pass common sense gun safety reform. Time and time again," he says, "giving Republican leadership the opportunity to hear the people of our state and to do the right thing." He says, "Today, I am delivering on my promise to call a special session to address gun violence across our state, and I'm calling on Republicans," he says, "to work with Democrats to get this done." Now, here's the thing. Democrats don't control the legislature in Wisconsin. Republicans control both the Assembly and the state Senate, and there is a reason why they have not approved these bills. Same reason why they're not likely to approve any bill that the governor might bring forward in this special session. And this, by the way, is not the first special session that we've seen Democrats call in an attempt to score some sort of political points over their Republican counterparts. We saw this in Virginia earlier this summer, where Governor Ralph Northam called a special session wanting to get eight gun control bills to his desk, try to shame Republican lawmakers into passing them. And Republicans said, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, they dismissed that special session after about an hour and a half. They said, we're going to have the Virginia Crime Commission take a look at all of these proposals, including proposals by Republicans. Democrats have been trying to make hay out of that in this year's election cycle, because we've got state elections coming up in Virginia in just a few weeks, and they're trying to use gun control as the hammer to actually replace the Republican majorities in the Assembly and the state Senate with anti-gun Democrats. And I suspect that something similar is at work here in Wisconsin as well. We've seen a number of stories in Virginia over the past couple of weeks talking about how gun control is a big issue for Virginia voters. And I think in large part that's because of the very one-sided conversation we've been having about the supposed effectiveness of these gun control laws. I sense that Governor Evers there in Wisconsin sees this as a winning political issue in 2020 and not really something that is going to pass out of the state legislature in Wisconsin. But we'll keep an eye on things there. I don't suspect that this is going to get a lot of support by Republican lawmakers, but stranger things have happened, so we'll keep our eyes on this. Speaking of strange things happening, maybe see this headline over the weekend where President Trump and the president of Mexico reached an agreement on border security. Now, this is being billed as the United States is going to crack down on illegal firearms crossing the border, but there's another side of this, and that is the president of Mexico says, well, this is going to allow for increased interdiction of drugs coming in from Mexico and into the United States. And I confess, when I first saw these headlines, I was a little concerned. I thought to myself, oh boy, what are we talking about here? Because if this were the Obama administration and we were to see a headline about President Obama, the president of Mexico, reaching an agreement on quote unquote illegal guns, that would have meant some gun control laws. That does not seem to be the case here. According to news reports, the Mexican president is talking about technology. And he said, we can stop at the border and freeze arms trafficking, which is causing issues in Mexico, like we've just seen, the running gun battle between cartel members and police in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, after police and members of the military tried to arrest one of El Chapo's sons, and the cartels fought back. Ultimately, the military had to pull back. Now, here's the thing. The weapons that were being used by the drug cartels, they're in, I believe it's called Culiacan. Might be mispronouncing that city's name. We're talking about truck-mounted machine guns. We're talking about, heavy artillery. We're not talking about things that you could get at your local sporting goods store, your local gun shop. And we know that Mexican drug cartels will acquire their weapons anywhere they can, including from the United States, but also including from Central American countries, where cartels have actually been known to pay off the military and go in and raid armories in Central American countries. So I feel for the president of Mexico. I've got friends who actually live in Mexico, and I talk to them on a regular basis about the cartel violence in their country. And I hope that increased technology will perhaps allow for greater seizures of firearms going to Mexico from the United States and drugs coming from Mexico to the United States. But the president is deluding himself. The president of Mexico is deluding himself if he thinks that that is going to actually address and solve the cartel violence there in Mexico. But again, if you've seen these headlines and you're wondering what the heck is going on here, so far this does not amount to any new gun control policies. This does not amount to any new gun control regulations. But again, using technology at border crossings to try to cut down on illicit trafficking. Speaking of trying to cut down on violence, Tacoma, Washington city council members expected to take up a tax on firearm sales and ammunition later this week. This is something that we've seen in Washington State before. Seattle, Washington, actually a few years ago, instituted their own gun and ammo tax, and the money was supposed to go to gun violence prevention programs. And they estimated that they were going to raise around $800,000 a year off of these guns and ammo taxes. Now, last year, they raised less than $100,000. Why is that? Well, as it turns out, a lot of gun stores simply fled Seattle. And they opened up in King County, outside of the Seattle city limits. They opened up in Seattle suburbs. And as of last year, there was one gun store in Seattle that was responsible for about 80% of the tax revenue generated by this increased tax on guns and ammunition. Meanwhile, violent crime has gone up in Seattle since this guns and ammo tax was put in place a few years ago. So it didn't bring in the money that it was supposed to. It didn't reduce violent crime, but you still got a lot of supporters in Tacoma that say, hey, you know what? We should do this too. We should do this too. I do get it. I say I don't get it, but I do get it, because it's not about public safety. It's about punishing gun owners. Which is what I wrote about at Bearing Arms this weekend, that this is not something that is really designed to make Tacoma, Washington a safer place. What it is designed to do is to inhibit individuals who could legally own a firearm from actually being able to afford to do so. Oh, sure, you might be able to afford the extra tax on the firearm itself, but what about those taxes on ammunition? A couple of pennies, they say, for every round of ammunition that is sold. So, you buy a box of, 522 long rifle. all of a sudden that's going to get pretty pricey. There was a columnist in Tacoma, Washington. His name is Matt Driscoll. He writes for the Tacoma News Tribune. And I want to read what he said in terms of why he supports this. He says, quote, "Yes, I think the tax on firearms and ammo can potentially do some good, providing a small revenue source to pay for gun violence prevention programming, which can't hurt. Anything helps." He says, but you know what? There's another part of me that's just so damn sick and tired of seeing the same tragedies and the same lame reactions, defenses, and non-responses that I'm simply ready for the city to do anything that it can. If that essentially amounts to a middle finger directed at the organized gun lobby, whose sole mission at this point, he writes, seems to be thwarting any and all common sense gun regulation, so be it. So in other words, this might not be common sense at all. This might not do much of anything at all, but because it is a middle finger to what he calls the organized gun lobby, I would call gun owners. Because it is a middle finger to gun owners, that's enough reason for Matt Driscoll. Now think about that. I don't care if you're a Second Amendment advocate or a Second Amendment hater. The right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. And the minute that you start using the power of the state to inhibit the exercise of a constitutionally protected right, not only are you on the wrong side of the law, as far as I'm concerned, you're on the wrong side of history. You want to go after the violent criminals in Tacoma, Washington? Go after the violent criminals. But when you decide that the answer is to try to crack down on people who are exercising a constitutionally protected right, you're wrong. And that's exactly where Matt Driscoll falls. That's exactly where several members of the city council fall as well, including a guy named Ryan Mello, who's the city council member who's actually sponsoring this. Fascinatingly enough, last week we had a story at Bearing Arms about the Bloomberg editorial board calling for a ban on gun possession for anybody convicted of a DUI offense. Well, as it turns out, Ryan Mello actually has a DUI in his history. Yeah, it was a few years ago he got pulled over for driving drunk. Got into a diversion program, though. Charges were dropped, even though apparently it's kind of rare for that to happen. So he doesn't actually have any of these charges, although gun control advocates might point to Councilmember Mello and say, listen, this is one of those loopholes here. So he got pulled over for drinking and driving, and then he got that diversionary plea, and now it's off his record, and he can legally own a gun. We need to put a stop to people like that. Like this gun control advocate who's proposing no more gun control laws. If you want to play that game, then we absolutely could do that. And sooner or later, I don't know if Ryan Mello is actually a gun owner or cares a bit about being able to own a gun, but sooner or later, gun control advocates are going to come for people like him as well. Because there's nothing commonsensical about this. This is simply trying to price people out of a constitutionally protected right. Not because you believe that there's some public safety benefit, but because you don't like gun owners. And again, if that's your attitude, you're on the wrong side of history. All right. Shall we get to our hero of the day? Wait. Our armed citizen story of the day, our good deed of the day, and our recidivism report? I think we should. Now, ordinarily, we would have a guest right now, but because I honestly didn't know whether or not to be able to do a show today, I felt really bad scheduling a guest, only to have to call him and say, yeah, you know what, we're not going to be able to do a show. So, no guest today, but tomorrow on Bearing Arms Cam and Company, Robert Verbruggen is going to be with us from National Review. We're going to talk about a story that has been going around for about a week or so. I actually had this story last week on Bearing Arms. CNN had the first story about this. It's an ATF regulation that really doesn't exist. The ATF is enforcing a law that or a reg that isn't really on the books, and it deals with the definition of a firearm and AR-15 receivers. And you've actually had individuals who have had charges dismissed because the ATF and the DOJ don't want an adverse court ruling that could impact these regulations dealing with firearms and lower receivers, 80% lower receivers. So they've chosen instead to simply drop these cases rather than risk in their mind, a bad precedent being set. What's going on here? Again, we'll talk about it with Robert Verbruggen on tomorrow's Bearing Arms Cam and Company. But right now, let's get to our recidivism report. Meet today's subject From Detroit, Michigan, that is 28-year-old Jerome Nowden, who is now behind bars on 4 felony charges relating to a shooting there in Detroit. But as the Detroit News reports, Mr. Nowden, well known to law enforcement, police say this current shooting took place on the city's west side last Monday, October 14th. The victim and Nowden had been arguing when the fight turned physical. Nowden pulled out a handgun, according to police, shot the victim, and then fled on foot. The victim, identified as Donovan Welch, was rushed to a hospital but died from his wounds. Now, the Detroit News says that Nowden is in the midst of a 3-year probationary term that started in January of this year, so less than a year ago. That sentence came from a March plea deal in Wayne County for receiving and concealing a stolen motor vehicle in March of 2018. All right, so you can say, look, well, yeah, he's known to police, but that's a nonviolent crime. Come on, he was a car thief, right? Fair enough. What about the other 14 or so convictions that have led to Mr. Nowden being placed on parole? According to the Detroit News, Nowden has had 14 probation terms over the years, ranging from cocaine and marijuana possession, to resisting a police officer, to firearms possession, to home invasion. And I love this phrase. I hadn't heard this phrase before. The Detroit News says that Nowden has been, quote, justice involved for most of his adult life. Yeah, so have police officers, right? And prosecutors. And I can think of all kinds of people who have been justice involved. I think this guy has more likely been justice deficient for most of his adult life if he has 14 probationary terms and he's still back out on the street. According to the Michigan Department of Corrections, half of Nowden's right big toe was amputated after a gunshot wound suffered in March of 2012. He was arrested 2 days after this shooting. Now is being held on 4 felony charges. Could face up to life in prison if he's convicted. Although, again, given the laundry list of charges that he has faced in the past and has avoided serious prison time, I'm not holding my breath that even being charged with murder is going to put Mr. Nowden behind bars for any prolonged period of time. On to our armed citizen story for you from South Carolina, Richland County, South Carolina, where a robber brought a toy gun to a gunfight, and that didn't work out too well for him. Ended up being held at gunpoint by his intended victim. I do love a story with a happy ending. This is from WLTX, Channel 19, Columbia, South Carolina. This happened Thursday morning outside of the Stop and Go convenience store in Columbia, South Carolina. Deputies called about 6:20 in the morning in reference to a fight. Again, less of a fight, more of an armed robbery. 24-year-old Devin Anderson, charged with that armed robbery. Anderson, according to authorities, jumped into the victim's vehicle, pointed a gun at him, tried to rob him of his valuables and a small amount of marijuana. The 2 victims began fighting. The victim pulled his own gun from his glove box, pointed it back at Anderson. The victim got out of the car, yelled for the clerk to call 911, held Anderson until deputies arrived. The gun turned out to be an airsoft pellet gun. He's facing armed robbery charges. Now, the victim in this case, the armed citizen, was cited for possession of marijuana. Could, I suppose, be facing more serious charges if they are pursued. But right now, looks like this was a case of self-defense, and perhaps this armed citizen will be able to get away with paying a fine for his cannabis possession. All right, on to our good deed of the day, where a police officer is helping a neighbor in need. This in Richmond Hill, Georgia. Michael Akers is an officer at the Georgia Ports Authority, and WTOC says that he is somewhat of a philanthropic cop, noting that a couple of years ago, Michael Akers handed out $1,200 worth of gift cards to drivers that he pulled over while patrolling in Richmond Hill, Georgia, and now he is putting some of his woodworking skills to use to help out a neighbor. He said, I think it's something that we should do as people in general. As a community and society, if it turns out that somebody's having a hard time, if somebody's going through something that they can't handle on their own, he says, I feel like they should be able to lean on their neighbors, lean on their community members, and try to look for some help that way. Even though he hasn't asked for it, Officer Akers said, I think it's something that we should simply do. So he is making a wooden flag. You saw there in the picture, this is not the flag that he's making, but he's using that thin blue line flag as a guide. He says he'll customize the flag however you want it if you win it. And the money that is being raised here is going to help provide a liver transplant for Officer Akers' neighbor, Jacob Mobley. We will give you a link to this fundraiser at bearingarms.com in the post that we put up right alongside this particular story. But in the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing for a neighbor in need, Officer Michael Akers there in Richmond Hill, Georgia. We thank you for your good deed. That is, unfortunately, all of the program that we have for you today, but we will be back. I promise you we'll be back tomorrow. The construction's over. And it's actually good because they buried some power lines, so come this winter, if we get any winter snowstorms, we should not lose power. We should be able to be on the air, and that's good as well. So apologies again for the inconvenience, but I'm glad to be back and glad that you're back with us. You can subscribe to Bearing Arms Cam and Company each and every day. Spotify, Stitcher, also Apple Podcasts, townhall.com podcast page. You can also subscribe to Town Hall Media on YouTube and never miss a program that way. Again, we thank you for your support, for watching, for listening, and for spreading the word. We'll see you back here tomorrow with Robert Verbruggen of National Review and a brand new edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company.